Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello, wonderful internets, and welcome to another edition of the Web Platform Podcast. We are diverse, inclusive, and we love the web. I am one of your hosts this week, Justin Ribeiro, and also welcome hosts Amal and Danny. How you all doing out there today?
Awesome.
Hey, Justin. Doing great.
And today we're on episode 124. 124 in. We just keep chalking them up. Web components, TypeScript, and bears. Oh my. And our guest today, speaker at the upcoming Web Components Remote Conf on February 16th and 17th, Mr. Kito Mann. Thank you for joining us on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually a big fan of this show, so I'm glad to actually be on it. And I remember your voice specifically, and the sort of announcer quality. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. We appreciate great developers like yourself coming on the show and telling us all about the cool things you're doing. And you're doing some amazing stuff with Polymer and TypeScript. But tell us a little bit about yourself to get started.
Well, I've been in the industry much longer than I care to admit at this point. I actually started writing code when I was a little kid. And my professional career actually started out with Delphi development. If anyone has heard of Delphi, it's an old school tool on the Windows platform. It actually still exists. I looked at it the other day. I'm like, wow, this actually still exists. But if you go way back to around when Visual Basic was hot, around that time period for client server before the web really even was around, Delphi was this awesome tool for writing desktop applications and client server apps in Turbo Pascal. Actually, it was Object Pascal, which was this variant of Turbo Pascal that the Borland had. And so I started out writing that with that, and then I moved into the Java world because the web was getting all hip and Java was hip at the time. And actually, I've spent most of my career writing Java applications. And my primary area was actually in enterprise Java stuff and Java EE. And it still is to a large extent. And I spent a lot of time working with a technology called Java Server Faces, which is actually a server-side component web framework. So I've written a lot of web applications. And basically, over the years, I ended up being the guy that was, and I did a lot of, training and architecture and mentoring and stuff. But I'd be the guy on the team who was dealing with all of the UI components that were in the application. And the way JSF works is that it has like a server-side layer for each component, but there's also a client-side layer. So basically, I ended up writing a lot of JavaScript, but and CSS, and on a team of Java developers where they didn't really do a lot of that stuff. So, but the key thing is components, because I really enjoyed with Delphi the ability to have these drag and drop components, because that was a big part of Delphi, was this visual component library they had and still do. And that was what led me to JSF, because I was like, wow, you can have like real componentized applications and you can do all this stuff. And JSF came out before JavaScript was really powerful at all. So you kind of needed server-side components back then. So JSF is still out there. I still do some of that work. But as I started looking into technologies, I ran across web components, and it filled in sort of my checklist of technologies that I like, which is basically components, because I really hate doing the same thing more than once, and I like having encapsulated functionality and stuff like that, and standards. I don't really like writing a cool component that only works with one framework, and then I can only use it in that one world forever. So that's what led me to web components, and naturally to Polymer as a way to write web components. So for the last couple of years, I've been doing that, in addition to still doing some Java stuff as well. Yeah, I can ramble more, but that's the quick nutshell version.
Delphi, man, Delphi. I remember Delphi. I was legit. Side note. I was looking at cross FPC, I think, which is a cross compiler for Delphi the other day. So I know the Delphi.
Really?
That's a crazy start point. Yeah, yeah, from way back when. Yeah, Borland days. Man.
Yep.
Allure Home Site, which was a great web development tool in its heyday, before Allure got bought by Macromedia, which got bought by Adobe, and got all thing. That was written in Delphi too, if I'm not mistaken.
Really?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was. Yeah, it was. Wow, cool start.
Yeah, I also like that your background is a little bit different than I think of a lot of people. Because we have a lot of purely front end developers come on the show. I mean, we have people that do a bunch of different stuff, but I think you've come into web components down a path that I think is, I don't know if is unique, but I don't think is the most common path to get to writing web components and thinking they're cool. Like a lot of people come through, the JavaScript framework world and, purely front end stuff. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. And I skipped a lot of that stuff, right? I didn't spend a lot of time writing Angular stuff. Angular 1, I've done some Angular 2 stuff, but I've done a lot of jQuery over the years, but that's largely because the JSF component suites I was working with were using jQuery internally to do a lot of stuff, which is a pretty common thing to do until recently. So I didn't really go through that. I did actually get to spend some time with Backbone and Marionette, but that is actually very recently. And we ended up rewriting it all in Polymer anyways. So so I kind of missed a lot of the JavaScript framework wars over the years. So
yeah, it's so funny. That's like actually what I was going to say. It seems like you saved yourself a lot of agony and pain. I think of people that are getting into writing JavaScript now with awesome libraries like React and Angular 2. And I'm like, wow, you don't understand how much pain like you've saved yourself by waiting like 6 years to start writing JavaScript. So congratulations,
Thank you.
So yeah, so I guess so what's the appeal with TypeScript? So I'm not writing TypeScript day to day. I'm still writing a lot of ES6, ES7. But again, like we still run into like the typical JavaScript hurdles, with not having that strong, type diff language. So I guess what's the appeal? What do you love about it? What's the 140-second the Twitter?
I can't do that 140 characters policies kind of stuff. But I will say that for me, I think part of it has to do with my background too. Is like I'm a Java developer, right? And even before that, I did stuff in Turbo Pascal, or Object Pascal, which is a strongly typed language too. So I come from that sort of background. In college, I learned like C and C++, and really the only sort of loosely typed or dynamically typed languages I worked with in my earlier years were the ones I messed with in college, like Smalltalk and Lisp, right? But I hadn't used those in production, so all my production work was in strongly typed languages. So when it comes to building larger scale JavaScript applications, you kind of need more structure, right? And the basis of JavaScript are fine for throwing together some code that works together, but when you build a real large scale application, you need more structure, which is why we have all these different frameworks and tools. But also one of the main things that has happened over the years is there's many different languages have been transpiled to JavaScript, right? And the reason is because no other language runs in every browser. And I don't think that there ever will be another language that runs in every browser, because the browser vendors they're not going to agree on a new language anytime soon. And also with a lot of things coming up, there just probably won't really be any need to do that. So basically, we're at a point where we have a virtual machine that runs in every browser, and there's one language it supports that has pros and cons. And if you want to target the browser, you've got to eventually get to that language. But I did a presentation at a conference actually in Poland a few years ago, several years ago. It was called JavaScript, the Assembly Language of the Web. And it was at a Java conference. So So a lot of the focus on that was basically I went through, all the different transpilers I could find, and looked at the pros and cons and everything. And it basically you can take any language, whether it's Java or from the Java virtual machine world. There's like Java, there's Scala, there's Ceylon, there's or Salon as they call it. There is what's the Kotlin, which is from the JetBrains guys that do WebStorm. All those run on the Java VM, but also transpile the JavaScript. And if you find the right tool or framework, you can do it. But then there's CoffeeScript, which is sort of just a variation, right? There's all of these other ones. So I kind of went through the process of looking at them all, and then I ran across TypeScript. And I was like, okay, here's the good thing about TypeScript. It is actually basically a superset of ES 2015 or ES 2017 or whatever, the current version of JavaScript, with strong typing. And there's a few benefits you get there. Number one, it's a much easier sell. When I've joined teams and said, hey, we should use TypeScript, it's much easier for me to say, okay, it's just a superset of JavaScript with some extra typing. And usually that works. And gradually, granted, the more you get into the language, the more of a learning curve you can have. But it's an easy entry point. Number two, it's the ability to add typing to existing libraries, right? So while any number of strongly typed languages may actually transpile to JavaScript, their ability to interact with any library that currently exists may be limited. And TypeScript has taken this as sort of a fundamental thing, is that, okay, you can provide all of these cool features, but at the end of the day, you're writing JavaScript, and you want to be able to use whatever libraries you want to use. So number one, you can use them without any special TypeScript features. You can just use them in a TypeScript application. You just don't get any strong typing when you use them. Or you can actually add typings for them. So there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different libraries that have actual typings that tell you the type of every single property and the types that all the methods return and everything. And for all that, you get cool IDE support and things like that. So it seemed to me sort of a good middle of the road. The other sort of main thing about TypeScript is that it is backed by Microsoft. It's very well, it's very well done, very well thought out. It's not going to go away anytime soon. And it's at a point in Microsoft's development where they're actually much more open than they used to be. So it's not like some proprietary Microsoft thing where you're going to get stuck in Microsoft land. No, TypeScript is open source. It's freely available. All the Angular guys are using it. It's really doing quite well. And the other selling point, once I got into it, and this is sort of the full circle part. I looked in to see who was working on it, and it was Anders Hallberg, the guy that invented Delphi and C#, and now he's on TypeScript. And I was like, oh, okay, so Anders is working on this. So it really gives us this whole pedigree in terms of actually, being very well designed language and everything, on top of, all the other things I mentioned. So that's sort of what drew me into it. It's just all those things. It just seems to meet that sort of good sweet spot. Now, I still have noticed there are areas where you still run into things that, are just, stupid typo you did doesn't work, or causes an error, but it gets a lot of those much easier than it would be without it. So I can't do 140 characters.
No, that was a great answer, actually. But so I guess JavaScript is maturing, right? We have all these developers from other languages that are adding all of these great, proposals to the language. We've got generators, we've got decorators. Ultimately, I feel like JavaScript is really going to be maturing at the, to a point where maybe we will have things that TypeScript gives us in a few years. So I mean, if I use things like object create with, strict properties, would I be getting the same benefits in JavaScript as TypeScript? I'm just curious where, at some point, can you write your code in JavaScript with, using very strict declarations and get similar benefits to what you're getting with TypeScript?
I think you can get a lot of it. And usually when I bring it in, it's on a project that's not even using like a transpiler. There's no Babel or anything being used, right? So, if I were joining a project where that were already the case, where they're at least using ES 2015, I wouldn't feel quite as strong of a need, because you do get a lot of those features. Some features aren't, I don't think decorators are in ES 2015 now. I think they're later. So they're in TypeScript. So like, I think a lot of the things, basically TypeScript sort of takes whatever the cool new JavaScript things are and gives you those plus the type safety. So if you're able to use all of the new cool JavaScript features in your transpiler, then really the only benefit you probably get from TypeScript is probably the type safety, right? There are some other interesting things it can do, but a lot of it is based around type safety. The main benefit you get there, for those who aren't terribly familiar with statically typed languages, basically you have TypeScript is essentially an optionally typed language, although you can make it more strict. But essentially, if you specify the type of an object, whether it's like an HTML element, or an object you created, or a number, or a string, or whatever, you can't call methods and properties on it which don't exist. You can if you cheat, right? You can always get around these things, but by default, you can. And what that means is, I think the number one thing is, if you have a good tool, and pretty much any editor is going to support TypeScript these days with a plugin, then you get code completion. And it's good code completion. It's not like, okay, let me guess all the 4,000 methods which you may be able to access. It's like, okay, these are the 10 methods that you can actually access, and these are the actual types that you can pass into those functions. So then if you pass in the wrong type, it complains and says, hey, that's not the right type. And you get all that so it really helps with the development process, because one thing I really hate, especially coming from a language like Java that has such good tooling when it comes to knowing what all the properties and methods are and the types and everything. I hate having to go to the web to find out what the hell to call on an object. It's like, or what the hell object it is that's being passed in. I'm like, I don't know what this thing is. It's called foo. I don't know what a foo is. What are the methods? And then I have to look up the API, go to the docs for the site. I really would just be able to for the IDE to tell me, okay, foo is a HTML element object. Okay, now I know. So, and the thing is that all that is, it's compile time, it's not runtime. So you can still have runtime errors, but at least at the compile time, you get the benefit of the editor knowing what's going on, and you get the compiler catching problems. So.
Yeah. So I totally agree. It's almost like it is a limited set of self-documentation almost at times. When I first started messing around with Angular 2, the docs, there are certain parts of the docs that still need work, but especially early on, you're like, there's no documentation for this, or the documentation is just prints out, here's what the class looks like. And I'm like, that doesn't help me at all. But then you can almost use the editor to help guide you through exactly what you're trying to help guide you through exactly what you need. So if you know that it's like, okay, here's the, I think a good example was dynamically creating Angular 2 components. It's like, okay, here's the resolver. And then you can just kind of follow it, and you're like, that method kind of sounds like what I need, and you can kind of follow it down this trail until you get stuff working.
Right.
So that stuff is kind of nice. So Kito, one of the main reasons we had you on is because you are speaking at the Web Component Conference here at, I was about to say next month, but it's in a couple of weeks now.
Yeah.
Which is terrifying for me, actually. But so could you give us a little bit of information about what you're going to be talking about? I think we can probably safely assume it has something to do with TypeScript at this point.
because this is a safe assumption. Yes. So basically, the presentation is called "Beautiful Web Apps with TypeScript and Polymer," or Polymer and TypeScript, something like that. Anyways, but basically, I'm just going to kind of walk through one of the projects I was on where we built. It was actually cool. It was my first and only so far IoT project. So there's all this stuff going on, all this stuff involved in the project, but the front end that we were working on was Polymer and TypeScript. We've got a web application, and we're talking to a Java backend that was using Spring Boot, so it was JAX-RS and JSON, basically a REST API. So it's basically that process that was my first actual real project where it was just Polymer and TypeScript, and I was the architect on the project. I had a little team, and so we learned a lot. And since then, I've actually worked on a few different applications with a similar architecture. So basically, the talk is to sort of talk about this application in particular and some of the things we ran into, and some of the other things we run into over time. And some of those things are based on TypeScript. The sort of the things you run into, what it's like working with a team of people who are not familiar with TypeScript. And some of it is also just Polymer web component stuff, building out a larger application without any other frameworks involved, what sort of things you run into along the way. So that's what the talk is about.
So I think that's a really valid, I'm excited that you're talking about that, because I think for me, the whole componentization model plus architecture isn't a problem that has been really solved well yet. And so, I think everyone's kind of doing their own thing. They're I guess, are there good, well-established patterns where you have a good UI infrastructure that is made up of multiple components?
I think these are the things people are figuring out. And I think if you look around, the few things have emerged, I'm just like everyone else. When I start a project, I usually get, for instance, if I'm doing a Polymer app, I get whatever the latest Polymer starter kit is, which seems to be a new one every year. But, I'll get that one, and I'll start just like everyone else. However, I will admit the more recent Polymer sort of app project, I found extremely limiting. They have actually opened it up a lot, but initially it was okay, I can't do anything I want to do now. I can build the application, but I can't hook in anything from the gulp script that I was using before. But they've improved that now. So I take whatever starter thing it is, but yeah, you find there's stuff you need, right? And even even with Polymer, the set of app stuff that came out with recently, which helps. So I've been using that on some projects as well. There's still some things you need. But I find there's a few things that people have learned over time, which is number one, have a top-level app element. So that's something that we went through as well. We didn't have one at first for this particular project. And then over time, I was like, I really just want a top-level component that has all the other stuff inside of it that can manage stuff. And then but I noticed everyone else seems to have the same understanding. so eventually everybody realized, okay, well, you should probably have a top level element, right? Then there's the idea that all the web component stuff takes a while to bootstrap itself. So sometimes if you need something up front, maybe it doesn't have to be in a web component or an HTML import or anything. Maybe it can just be a JavaScript file that gets loaded before all the other crap. There's things like that. And I think I think that some of those common patterns have emerged, right? But I think there's some other things which still need to be sort of clarified. One of them is error handling, and I am like an error handling nut. I do presentations on exception handling. It's just one of my things that, So dealing with that in the Java world, and it's the same issue in JavaScript world. How do you handle errors in a consistent way? With frameworks, you get some of that, like Angular 2 just catches everything and handles it in a certain way, right? So one of the things I've been working on recently is an exception handler component, which I think is a pretty good, because previously what I had done in another project was basically the top level component handled exceptions in a certain way. So all those things you kind of learn over time. But I agree with you. We're still sort of working out those things, but I think we're getting a lot closer. If you look at what people have come up with, even if sometimes honestly, I'll do things like, if I find any application which is using Polymer or web components, I'll spend a little bit of time looking to see how they did it, right? And you'll see that all of them have a top level element now. So
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I've done it both ways in Polymer apps, where you have the top level element, and then you don't. They do have there are trade-offs with both. But,
yeah.
I think you bring up a good point, which is there's still a lot of paradigm sort of things shifting out right now. How do you get to that really fast first paint, and how do you get to that first interaction speed pretty quickly? Are you updating
Yes.
Are you doing, are you thinking about your application in a way that you don't have to spend so much time booting up? I think this is a big topic we see with most of the Chrome traces that, folks are putting out now. I mean, that's sort of my 2017 resolution, by the way. Every time Justin releases something, it's time to add a Chrome trace to it.
Good idea.
I feel like it's a good resolution, but at the end of the day, ideally, we get to better paradigms as a whole. Which, I mean, are you seeing people out there, as someone who's, and I admit I do the same thing. Oh, like the HP site the other day, right? Ooh, it's Polymer.
Yes.
I wonder what they did. I mean, do you see a lot of, sort of improvements in the way people are approaching sort of componentization on the web today?
Well, I think so. I think, yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like we're all learning. I mean, even if you just look at the stuff the Polymer team has put out over time, you can see their perspective has changed a lot. One of the things which I find fascinating is I just saw the other day that project, what is it? Uniflow for Polymer, which is sort of a different way to handle property binding or data binding. That basically has sort of the React perspective, where you push the data down and you do any other changes through events. Because Polymer has two-way data binding, which is good and bad. So you see, and I think the people that did that, which I think are actually from Google, they said, well, they're running into issues debugging larger applications. So I think we're seeing things like that. But the React folks would say, well, we figured that out a long time ago. Yeah, I think we're figuring out more. And I actually do feel like when it comes, I mean, I think there's two different things though. There's building out of web components by themselves, right? Well, there's three. There's just using whatever components your framework provides, whether it's React or Angular. And then there's trying to use web components with other frameworks. And I think we're talking more about the first case. You're just using web components. How do you structure things? Because if you're in one of the other worlds, then you go by whatever the norms are of that world, right?
Yeah, the integration story is different.
Yeah.
Some of that I think is also still being hashed out. I mean,
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't think we have a magic bullet or a particular approach that is going to be the only approach that people take. Obviously, some good things have come out of a lot of the sort of initial experimentations have been around web components too. To your point, right? Even the Polymer team has made shifts. Obviously, we've seen things like Skate.js come out. With their particular approach, the Uniflow thing is actually pretty interesting. Primarily because data binding has been, Polymer gives you the sugar to do so, but you still have to, architecturally as a, an engineer or as a developer, make the choice of how your application is going to actually handle the way data moves in and out of it,
Yep.
Whether that's through components or through a framework or however you want to actually do that. So there's still a lot of that story being worked out, but at least we have, again, and I think you said this at the beginning of the show, which was we have standards, right? Standards are a good thing, and this gives us the means to sort of make things that have forward futures as opposed to one shot, I'm going to have to rebuild this in 2 years when the framework flops over.
Yeah, and that's sort of when I'm trying to sell web components, that's kind of what I say. I'm like, the good thing about standards is that, the stuff they put in the browser, they don't really take out. Like, perhaps there'll be some deprecation process, or maybe there is one I'm not aware of. But if so, it's not going to be a quick thing, and it's not going to happen anytime soon.
I thought IE invented the deprecation process. You know, the one where they don't tell you about it.
Yeah, well, the best part of IE is deprecating it altogether.
Exactly. No offense to all the hard work that went into making that browser, but so I actually just, you know, piggybacking back to the best practices in the architecture piece. You know, obviously, I think, you know, you can't undermine critical mass, right? I mean, even with React, I mean, until companies like Netflix and, you know, Airbnb really started adopting it and pushing it and, like, you know, building these like massive applications, you know, it wasn't like, you know, there weren't as many good practices, right? So, I mean, I don't know, has the critical mass been reached for web components? I don't think so. You know, but it feels like that's kind of like a good tipping point for like pushing and, you know, getting more brains and more eyes and more ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think Google, I think we're getting there with Polymer, but Polymer is not all of web components, right? So it does give you some help, the binding being the number one thing probably. Doesn't, you know, and as time goes on, you know, it's getting smaller. So I think, you know, eventually it's going to be just a whole bunch of building blocks and components and maybe data binding, and that's it. But I think that we're getting there, but yeah, it's not the same as Angular or React. But I think that, to me, what's helpful is really Google. I mean, and Google's fascinates me, having, you know, Polymer and Angular really essentially being, you know, open source Google products. I mean, I know there's external contributors to both, but I mean, you know, they're pushed by Google. But you know, Google is doing a lot with Polymer. I mean, I you know, they always tout these stats at, like, you know, Chrome Developer Summit or the Polymer Summit, but, you know, it's hundreds of thousands of pages and lots of projects. And if I'm not mistaken, I mean, they're actually redoing YouTube in Polymer. And they've already done YouTube gaming and some things like Google Patents and stuff like that. The Chrome Developer Stats site is Polymer. So to me, that's a really big help, is getting an idea about the things they've learned along the way. And all that stuff, I think, sort of influences the Polymer team. Outside of Google, you know, you see companies like GE, and a lot of them have actually been on the web platform podcasts, right? Like GE and Atlassian, and some others that are doing a lot of stuff. And actually, what was the other one? Comcast, you guys did one on too as well, right? So to me, that, I mean, it's certainly not, you know, doesn't have the same level of complete buzz that, you know, the others do, but I think there's enough companies using it, and a lot of them also are finding use cases, you know, that aren't just Polymer. You know, there's, like, for example, Atlassian with Skate and everything. So you know, I kind of think that stuff is coming, and it's actually here to some degree. So,
how do you feel that things like so we've mentioned Polymer and Skate several times. You did say that Polymer is not all of web components. How do you see, especially with the V1 specs for custom elements landing in a lot? I mean, they just landed in Safari, right? Or they either just landed or they're about to land?
They're in 10.1 beta.
Yeah, I didn't think it was, yeah, okay, that sounds about right.
Yeah. So how do you feel that vanilla custom elements fit into the overall web components world, or do you think that they are something that will be relegated to, you know, kind of the lower level, and then we will have these other libraries that make them easier to work with?
Well, I think they've gotten a lot better. I mean, if you compare the V1 stuff to the V0 stuff, the API is a lot less verbose and a little easier to deal with. So, you know, when it comes to writing a custom element, it doesn't nearly seem as much of a pain as it did before, which is awesome. But if you look at what the libraries give you, they still do some things a little better. Like, number one is probably just integrating the templating with the custom element. So that's probably the number one thing that they do, other than data binding. So I kind of think that what you'll find is that custom elements are probably going to be more of a low-level construct that will live. Like I said, doesn't Angular 2 use custom elements in there somewhere? I think I heard that. I don't know if it's actually true, but
So they use Angular 2 makes heavy use of the template tag. I know. I don't know if there's any actual custom element code in the Angular code base. I could be wrong, but I don't think it's there. But they do make heavy use of the template tag.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, I kind of think we're going to see it in use, number one, by component developers. And that's an area that I'm pretty familiar with because on the JSF or Java Server Faces side, I dealt with component developers in that space. So anyone that's writing a library or third-party components, whether it's externally to for open source or for selling or for sale, or internally inside larger companies, I think they're much more likely to use the raw APIs because their goal is to make it work with as many technologies as possible, right? So adding Polymer or whatever other libraries on top of it is going to limit that possibility. And then I think people who are building entire applications out of web components are probably more likely to use some library on top of it just because it makes their lives a little bit easier. So that's kind of my take.
I like the V1 spec. I mean, I've been toying with the idea of using it in a capacity that basically doesn't have like DOM, like in the case of like just pure API sort of custom elements that sort of exist, sort of exist in their own realm. Like I'm rewriting one at the moment for a controller that kind of exists as only that thing. So I get the separation that I want without having, the UI element on top. So I mean, I think again, I agree with your point. I think that if you have a particular plan that has significantly more in it, if you're building an application that has a component structure, then you can make choices that, are informed by that architecture. As a component developer who's, might be trying to give access to an API or things, that sort of changes my philosophy. Because I can Polymer shim something too, like with just a custom element API, right? That's the beauty of it. I just want to also thank Danny for not bringing up Shadow DOM. I don't want to have that argument today, Danny. I don't want to have that argument.
Not today. We'll save it. We'll save it for later. But Justin, I actually agree with you a lot about the. It's kind of odd. The first web components I ever started working on, Eric is the one that actually introduced me to a lot of the concepts of web components, specifically with Polymer. The first stuff we started working on had no UI, which is kind of interesting. So I've always had a little bit of a fascination with that. When the V0 spec was out, and I actually need to update a lot of my old components to do this, is that I would just pick an HTML5 JavaScript API in the browser, and I would create a web component wrapper around it to see what that type of, how that type of thing would work. I think I did one for the notification API. Did one for, I can't even think, accelerometer, geolocation, stuff like that. They're surprisingly straightforward, and as long as you have the cool thing about using them in that way, one of the first things that a lot of people know when you're first starting to learn how to do front-end development stuff, it's like, okay, here's HTML. Okay, here, write some JavaScript to go grab a reference to this element and do something to it. And so that is something that a lot of people, even with very minimal front-end experience, understand. And if you can just wrap up these APIs in this abstraction layer that is HTML, it's an easy concept to then have other people start using. So if you, like with the notification thing, you don't have to know how to use JavaScript at all. You can just drop it in, set a timer on it, or configure it in a certain way, and it will throw a notification. I think things like that are really cool.
Yeah, that's along the lines of using the platform, right? They use the platform.
Yeah, and that's a good point about the whole non-visual aspect, because for anyone who hasn't really used web components yet, essentially you get a custom tag, right, that can do whatever you want. And there are some elements which don't, they're not visual. Like the most popular one in the Polymer world is Iron Ajax, which does, it's XHR requests. I use it all the time. And you're right, there's a whole set of components you can write which don't need a UI, and you really don't need any sugar for that from Polymer or anything else. It's a very good point. What I also love, I was just looking at this today, and this also is just partially due to the nature of, web applications in JavaScript, but, what I love is the ability to dynamically interact with the component in the console. So, I was doing some testing on a page. I'm also big on unit testing, so I had, I have unit tests and stuff, but I also needed to just double check in the real application. So, I just found the element for that page in the DOM tree in the Chrome Developer Tools, and then changed the property to make sure that the change that I thought I worked actually was working. And it's really cool to be able to navigate the DOM tree to find the thing to interact with, and then work with it that way. So I think that's another kind of cool feature.
That's awesome. Like I think this whole like JavaScript in the raw is becoming more and more popular, because I think like as frameworks become like this moving target, I think a lot of people, including like, my company, we're moving more towards, a lot of our core business logic being in modules that are not like, that are fairly agnostic, they either interact with a platform or they interact with a framework, but, but they're central and they're pure in that sense. So.
Well, and then there's a lot of debate just generally in the community, right, about where do you start today, right? You have a lot of specs and a lot of frameworks and a lot of classes that folks can take online. That can get difficult to navigate as someone who doesn't necessarily know where to start, right? Do you learn the language? That's how I was always taught, right? You learn a base language and then you sort of expand out into the many sort of things that exist in the world that we live in. But doing that today is tough, right? You can pick up a framework and get some work done immediately, but that doesn't really teach you about the, how the compositor works in a browser, or, how the platform itself works, which can be detrimental to doing more advanced things later on. So, I'm always a fan of the learn the basics first, as opposed to a framework or even a library. But that can be that's a difficult thing to do. When you're working somewhere and you have business that needs to be done and you have tasks, and that's tough. I feel like we're covering a lot of ground here. Deep internal conversation.
I have a burning question on TypeScript, but I don't want to diverge from this awesome web components topic. Just because I don't use TypeScript day to day, so I'm poking holes at TypeScript, even though it's like poking holes at like the Hulk or something. But basically,
I feel like not poking holes, you're not doing your job. You have to break some things.
Yeah.
What's your question? What's your question?
Okay, my question is basically that, like, a lot of people don't use closures in JavaScript, to their maximal potential, right? So there's a lot of like putting on, using underscore to kind of infer that it's private, but it's not really private because you can actually access it from anywhere, things like that. So ultimately, if you're using closures, if you're using object create with strict types, if you're using, these tools, if you're using good patterns, don't you get a lot of that benefit? I'm just trying to really understand like the value prop here. Like, is it like the I want it to be easy, I don't have to worry, I don't want to have to be strict? Like,
can I give my response to this first? And I'm curious to see if yours is the same. The big thing overall is that is all happening at runtime. With TypeScript, it all happens at build time. So a lot of that type of stuff. Again, you can still have errors at runtime, but the idea is to catch as many of those potential errors before you have to run the application in the browser. or a Node or wherever you're using TypeScript. That's my immediate response to it.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. Yeah, I mean, I can put an underscore in front of something, but if I can, at build time, if I can access it, and runtime I can access it, then it's not really private, right? At least TypeScript says at build time you can't access it. Now at runtime, all bets are off. but yeah, and actually, my general pattern these days is put underscore in front of it and put private in front of it. So at runtime, I can tell it's supposed to be private. At compile time, I actually get the checking. So yeah, I think that's a good answer, Danny.
All right, that makes sense to me, guys. I'm sold. I get it. I'm gonna take the JS off and just slap on TS. So.
It won't be a big jump for you, trust me. If you're already using all the fancy new JavaScript features, it's not a big deal. So.
Well, that's what I thought, but
It's official. Amal, I expect next time that you tell us that all of your stuff has been converted to TypeScript, and you're only now just going through and making sure things are as strongly typed as possible. That's right. The expectation.
Where's the fun in that? Come on, if there's no bugs, what am I supposed to do?
Right, bugs are definitely job security, but like there is a threshold to like making more bugs than you fix, and therefore it is not a threat.
So bugs are job security. There is a threshold there about what types of bugs are job security and which types are job ending.
That's the fine print
statement. Yes.
Well, that has to do with what your application is responsible for too.
Yeah.
Whether it's money or lives. Then
are you saying that my cat GIF generator is not important to society right now? I feel that's what's happening right now.
That's not what he said. He didn't say it wasn't important. Not critical.
I'm saying you're less
it is critical
fired over
in these times.
Well, but it does make me happy though to know that there is not that much JavaScript that is responsible for saving lives and or keeping lives.
You would be surprised. You would be surprised, and I can't talk about things, but about the true.
I would say, as somebody that works for a company called LiveSafe,
that
is largely focused around keeping people safe, that is running currently a lot of JavaScript, I would disagree.
So developer livelihoods probably should not rely on bugs as a whole. Maybe just let's focus on feature development as a whole. You're out there listening, going, I don't understand what they're talking about right now. It's fine. Eventually, you'll have this conversation in your office.
We have to end this.
You probably should. So we're running up against time indeed. Daddy brings up a solid point. What have we not asked that we probably should have asked?
I had a couple things I wanted to mention.
Please.
One is that that Polymer, like many libraries out of the box, does not support TypeScript. I mean, it works with TypeScript, but it doesn't have any built-in stuff for it. So I've been using a library called Polymer TS, which is on GitHub. It's worked out really well. There's been some edge cases when you deal with lots of subclasses, but for the most part, it works really well. And there's a new library out now, which I forgot the name of. Maybe I can find it for the show notes. But the main thing is that Polymer 2, they have already been talking a lot about TypeScript. And there is a branch that has all this TypeScript stuff, which they haven't really talked about publicly, but it actually is on GitHub. So I suspect that there's going to be a bigger TypeScript story for Polymer 2, which I think is supposed to be out sometime this year. So that's all I wanted to add.
TypeScript is pretty cool. I think you see it's definitely starting to travel in a lot more places. Obviously, things like Lighthouse, the PWA tester that Google writes, the CLI is written in TypeScript as well. There's a lot of interesting sort of, beyond interesting, I think, is the thing now. I mean, it's just useful. When you have things that become useful to get the job done quicker, those things have a tendency to stick. And I think TypeScript is probably one of those things. It looks like, at least.
It's definitely not going anywhere.
No.
Right now, anyway.
Yes.
We'll get it 6 months.
So, Kito, you're speaking at Remote WebConf for a couple weeks. Where else can people find you on the internets?
You can find me at Kito99 on Twitter. My company site is virtua.tech. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't know. Those are probably the best places.
You're the first person we've ever had that has shouted out their LinkedIn profile.
Hey, I didn't mention the URL. I just said I'm on there.
I think everybody's on there.
Don't try to be my friend, please.
I check it. It's one of those. When do you check it? I check it once a year. That's the common response these days. Danny, Amal, anything to add as we wrap up episode number 124?
Just remind everybody what days Web Remote Conf is. Web
Remote Conf, which we will be putting in the show notes as well, so you can come get a ticket, is February 16th and 17th, just here in about 12 days. So tickets currently are $20. It's entirely remote. You can come and see, and we're about to announce that all the ticket sales and things are we're donating to Girls Who Code. So it's going to be exciting. It's got a great panel. We got great speakers like Kito who are coming out. And if you have any questions, you can always ping us on Twitter and whatnot. So it's going to be pretty cool. We're pretty excited. And shout out to Leon, who's not on the show today because he had something to do, but he's been doing a whole bunch of work on it as well. And I just want to say thanks, because it takes people to do these sorts of things, and conferences are hard.
Thank you, Leon.
He's out there. I know you're listening. All right.
This is really great, Kito. Thank you so much.
Yes,
I'm a converter. I'm converted. Hallelujah. TypeScript will be our savior.
Well, it's been a pleasure being here.
Well, thank you so much, Kito, and thank you to everyone who's out there listening. This has been episode number 124 of the Web Platform Podcast. We hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at +the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at eIsaacson,
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.